Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. I think we're all still reeling from what we saw last week at the airport in Washington, D.C. and also in Philadelphia. We had two plane crashes. One was the small aircraft in Philadelphia that was an ambulance aircraft, and the other was an American Airlines flight that collided with a helicopter at the Reagan International Airport in D.C., and there were no survivors. I believe in either of those examples there, but with both the helicopter and the plane and then the ambulance airplane as well, no survivors. And I think the entire country is reeling over this. We see this and there's brings up a bunch of fear over flying, but also just the knowledge of all of these families that have lost someone. I mean, I think as a parent, I watch this and I go through and I see these stories of kids that were lost, parents that are lost, and kids that are now without a parent. And you just watch this and you think, how do people get through this? And then you see people who, I mean, I think we all watched where the man was in the airport. And if you didn't see this, it was very hard to watch. There was a young man in the airport and he was waiting for his wife, and he had just received a text from her saying, "We're landing. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And he was waiting to see what happened. And a reporter came up and asked to see the text message from his wife. And people were like, wow, this is so invasive but I think at that time, I give that reporter maybe a little grace, because I think at that time, that reporter probably didn't know what was happening either, because it's so unusual to have an aircraft just go down like this and to lose everyone on board. But I'm so glad that we have someone with us today who wants to talk about this. And her situation is, she's lived through this herself. It's a devastating situation, but I think all of us are in that at that moment where we're saying, how do you get through something like this? What is this like? And how do you get past the fear? So I have, at the time of the incidents for her name was Heidi Snow. So you may have heard of her, but her name is now Heidi Snow. Heidi, thank you so much for joining us. You've gone through this yourself, and I appreciate you willing to share, because you lost your fiancé on TWA Flight 800 back in July of 1996. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
I mean, as we watch this, we think about people who go through this, and I don't know how you get through it. Your story is, to me, especially emotional. He actually proposed to you right before he got on this flight, right?
Yes, shortly before, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. What happened leading up to the flight, and then finding that out? What is that like?
Well, so we were in New York, and he was heading to Paris to train. He was a hockey player who had been on the Harvard hockey team and was a professional hockey player, and he was going back for training in New York. And I just remember he went off to the airport, and then a couple hours later, I get a phone call from my mom saying, "Please tell me Michelle did not get aboard a plane going to Paris tonight." And I just remember turning on the TV to the dark debris in the water floating, and hearing basically that they're looking for survivors and that this plane has gone down. And I just remember just holding on to hope. And when they said they're looking for survivors, and that there's a moment where you're holding on hope that somehow he's going to swim to shore. He's okay. I know he's in those waters, but he's okay. And as I turned on the TV and saw this, it was reliving my loss once again, and just thinking of all of them and how everybody's going through these painful thoughts in their mind, and all the unknowns. I mean, one thing about air disasters that's different than most sudden losses is there's really a lot of time involved in figuring out, were they officially on the plane? And then until their remains are found, sometimes there's still a little bit of time where we all hope somehow they swim to shore, they're okay. And so as this process goes on, it's a really difficult, as the reality starts to sit in and we realize that they're really gone forever. Most of us expect a separation of just days, and then suddenly it's forever. And going through that process is really hard. And also with air disasters, it's particularly hard because we just don't know what their last moments were like. Did they know this was happening? Were they scared? Was there anything? There's a lot of information that we just don't have about what the final incident was like for them. And so right after the incident, I remember we all gathered together outside of JFK Airport, and all the families came together, and we waited for the remains to be found. And I just remember being there for days. And when I did shut down the site, still his remains had not been found. And I remember trying to go back to life as normal. And basically they're saying our site's shut down, but go on with your life and we'll let you know if they're found, for the people who hadn't had their loved ones found. And I found it particularly difficult. So I went back to New York City, and I remember I went to the mayor's office and I said, I lost my fiance. Is there a support group here for air disasters? And he said, there isn't one, but we need one. But he also said, the families of Pan Am Flight 103, which crashed 8 years earlier, were all gathering together because they were reliving their losses from witnessing Flight 800. And so I remember a very kind person from that organization reached out and actually came and picked me up and drove me to their meeting. And when I showed up there, it was so important for me. I got to talk to other fiancés. I got to see other people who had been through this and realize that they're functioning and they're okay and they're still alive, and they were sharing their stories and I was sharing my story, and being in the comfort of them, other people who'd been there before, meant so much to me. So I remember at that meeting, I said, wait, I'm the only person here from Flight 800, but we all need you. And so I invited everybody. I said, please give me your name and number and who you're lost. And let's start making sure that you're on call for these families, because you've helped me so much. I really need to know that we can pair you up with others from our incident. And that's actually how Access started. A very long time, 27 years ago, was in that room at that meeting when I learned that the only people who really got it were people who had been there before. And then unfortunately, after that Swiss Air crash, so then our TWA families and our Pan Am families were then on call for those families. And then we had an Egypt Air crash, again at JFK. And then we had 9/11. And then we had Alaska Airlines, which just had their anniversary 2 days ago. We just sat with them through their memorial service. So a lot of them are reliving their losses as well as they're watching this all unfold. And so our whole main purpose of Access is to make sure people know that they're not alone and that we're here for them. So when people call for help, we pair them up according to who they lost. So if somebody lost a child, we pair them up with another person who lost a child. And we really give them a mentor who will guide them through the process, not just in the immediate, because right now there's a lot of wonderful people caring for them, at different sites in different locations, but we're there for the long term when they say, how do I clean up my child's room? How do I go back to work? How do I live after this? So we're there after the funerals. We're there after the memorials, and our grief mentors are just a community of people who've really lived through this pain before and all the unknowns that come along with it that are super challenging. And so we have the kindest, nicest people who, everybody came forward right when this happened saying, I'm on call, we're ready. And then we're all talking and we're all connecting as well, because it just brings us all back to day one when our lives all changed in an instant.
And certainly an emotional support group that you don't ever want to have to expand, because that means that another disaster has occurred. And yet here it is, a situation that people will definitely need support through. And I think one of the things that I read about you that I found so fascinating was that people were like, okay, the funeral's over. You should move on. You should get back to life. And I think anytime there's a sudden death like this, I remember we lost a classmate when I was 16. He was hit by a car. And that was kind of, once the funeral was over, that was kind of how even my family kind of reacted, like, okay, go back to school. And I couldn't, like, my mind was so wrapped around, how can this happen? How can he just be gone? How can life just end like that? And I think with what you're saying with the airplanes and the aircraft casualties, it is so different because it's not just you that knows. I mean, when you talk about someone having a sudden death, it's like your community wraps around you and your family wraps around you. But in this case of the flight in DC of Flight 800, we all watched it, so the entire country is going, we demand answers. What happened? Is this going to happen to us? There's this collective fear that probably doesn't make you feel any more comfortable. It's probably much more difficult to manage when it's on the news every day.
Right. And yes, definitely with Flight 800, for example, there's been a lot of unknowns of what actually caused the incident, and that's gone on for years and forever, actually. But really, at the end of the day, our focus is no matter what caused it, our loved ones still don't come home to us, and so our focus is really on the grief piece and just making sure that people have people who will honor their loved ones with them for the long term. So we always celebrate their birthdays with them. We make sure that they're never forgotten and that we're there for them for the duration, for a long time. So you're really given basically a best friend who is there for you when you need to talk to them, who really remembers being there themselves and just being a peer support. And a lot of our care, you're not telling them exactly what to do. That's not what we do. What we do is with the comfort of having somebody to talk to who's been there before. And when you're saying this, when the rest of the world doesn't comprehend it, our grief mentors do. They're really role models and people they can also look to, like, how do you do certain things that other people wouldn't understand would even be difficult, such as, just like I mentioned earlier, like going back to work, or over time we've had some people who've gotten remarried, for example, and a lot of them talk to their grief mentors saying, how do I incorporate my loved one who I miss so much in my future now? And how do I, a big piece for the parents is, how do I make sure to honor their loved one and make sure that for example, if their spouse passed away and they have a lot of children, our grief mentors say, here's some ways to honor the loved ones and teach your children how to remember them. And so we focus on very specific things based on the relationship of who they lost.
So what was it like for you? Because when you lost him, there's this iconic picture of you on the beach with family, kind of saying goodbye, but probably not. I mean, that's how, as the world, we saw it that way. Oh, they're out there saying goodbye. That was just the beginning of goodbye for you. And really, probably not really at that point prepared to say, yeah, we've given up hope, because I imagine that having never found his remains, there was for months a part of you that was like, could he be somewhere? Could he be in a hospital somewhere? Could there be like a memory loss situation? I just imagine like all the things that my mind would go through, hoping that he was still around.
Right. Yes. And a lot of our grief mentors do identify with that. I mean, yes, the rest of the world says, of course, they're gone and look at the news. But in our case, we really do count on that to hold on to hope. And that picture you're speaking of, when I'm sitting there by the water, his remains had still not been found yet. And so I remember that very well, just holding out hope. Maybe nobody else in the world would comprehend this. And it doesn't sound like it makes any sense to anyone else, but it was hope that I held on to, that somehow maybe he's survived it somehow. And so I know at this point, they found many of the bodies, but there's still many that have not been found yet. So it's a very difficult time right now. And there's just a lot of phases with this, back to, as you were speaking about earlier, it's like right now it's in the news and all of that. And then there's new events that happen, new information comes out, and sometimes it's not accurate. And then that can be hurtful too for the families as well. So I think many of us really understand that aspect of it, of the all the unknowns that are coming forward, and who do you listen to, what facts that are coming forward are true right now, or what really happened. And so a lot of us went through that process, and still today there are unknowns, even with Flight 800 and many of the other incidents too.
I imagine that it's different now even than when you went through this, because when you went through this, my gosh, there wasn't social media, there wasn't the access to information and the wrong information that there is today. And I think that's where you've had all this discussion of, the pilot, and did our family keep her name out of it for too long? But my gosh, can we just be respectful of these people who have lost someone? And I think we have become a society that's like, we demand information immediately. We want it right now. But we forget sometimes that this is 67 families. And it's so much more than that, because that's what I always say when there's a disaster like this. It's not just 67 families. It's everyone they touched. It's all the people they worked with, all their best friends, all of their groups that get together, their kids play with. Everybody in the community across the country is affected by this, because it's such a mass casualty event that you have to respect the fact that they're going through something you cannot even imagine. It's such a special group of people that will be able to bond like this through access, because they've all gone through something that so few of us will ever understand on such a public level, where there is such a demand. If you lose a loved one in a car accident, the entire country's not like, how did it happen? We want to know. But in this case, you have everybody in the country saying, we're not going to get on a plane again. Tell us what exactly happened here. And they're making assumptions. How do you handle, now that things have changed with social media, how do you handle that? And how do you come around the families in that case?
It's definitely changed a bit in that regard. And it is very difficult. And that's why we're there. We're there for people to be able to talk about how that can be very difficult. And it's really having somebody else who remembers. We have had people, for example, in general aviation crashes where they blame the pilot, and they're reading this in the news and it's their father, and they're saying, wait, what are you talking about? He was such a skilled aviator, and your facts aren't necessarily true. And people, the news hadn't even said it. It was some person speculating. And so a lot of things, you're hitting on a good point, which can be really hard when information comes out that may or may not be accurate. And it's also insulting to the family members to have to hear things like that about their loved ones. So the press and the media can actually be quite challenging during this time as well. And we do focus on that, and we recognize that. And over the years, I've interviewed people all around the country, and I actually wrote a book called Surviving Sudden Loss: Stories from Those Who Have Lived It, where people share the story from the moment they learn their loved one was affected by a disaster or any type of sudden loss. And then they give the story of who they've become over time, and they just describe what was helpful, what was hurtful, some of the things that people said that was not quite as effective, even though the person meant well. So we've done a lot of research in that space, and we actually use that to sometimes train the airline care teams and let them know what families from the past have said, because it's really learning from those who have lived it is really, I think, the most effective care for first responders who are on the site right now, and also for friends who mean well and would like to say the right things but don't quite know what to say, and that kind of thing. So that's another piece that we really work on, and it's all based on data we've collected from people who have been in those shoes and lived through that moment of right when they learned they were lost. And we've even changed. So some airlines have the call centers, and they have to actually call the families and let them know their loved one was aboard the aircraft. So we've done training with an airline on that. Like, how do you make that phone call? How do you introduce yourself and let them know this happened? And I basically took data from other people who remembered reading that phone call and receiving it. And basically they described, I remember when the person said this to me, but it would have been better maybe if they said this. So we really, in a very positive way, nobody means harm in any way.
Right.
Grief, I know everybody means to say the right thing, but so that has been a lot of our focus over the last 27 years, actually interviewing people who have lived it. So that way people on the front lines know the best way to greet them and talk to them and make them feel heard.
Well, and that's kind of why I brought up the reporter that went up to the husband who was at the airport, because I think that, hindsight is 2022, right? We're seeing this after the fact. This had just happened. I think that most of us I don't really think we fully understood until morning that there would be no survivors. At that point, we're still hearing on the news, like they're in the water, they've got lights out there, they're trying to find people. And you don't really have a full understanding. And it's so rare. I think the last one was 2006. It's so rare to have a mass casualty aircraft event that I think that reporters don't necessarily know how to handle this in the situation. It's unfortunate that got posted, I think, because my heart goes out to that man. He's in his moments of finding out that he's lost his wife, but really not understanding what has happened. And that's all recorded, and it's all immediately out on social media. What would be your advice to the media at this? I'm sure you had plenty of media contacting you. Give us a little overview of what that was like and what you would say to the media if you could talk to them right now. And
I remember what would be, I just think the main thing is for them to listen and say, tell me about them. Tell me about your loved one, and not really necessarily go into the politics of it and asking them questions about the recovery and things like that. So I think it's really important to really focus on who they lost and let them share what they're comfortable sharing. and letting them, because it's also part of the grief process too, to honor them. So sometimes if a news story can be done well, they're actually talking about the loved one lost and not so much about the mechanics of the air disaster and what happened. It's really like, I think sometimes everybody's trying to figure out what happened and what the politics are around it and all of those things. But the main thing is that these people are not coming home. And to really, I think it's most important for people in the media to really focus on who they lost and ask them questions about that person and who they were. And that's really that's we focus on the grief piece. And
yeah, I mean, I think
none
we
of this
are.
other stuff actually matters down the road. It's really that this person is gone and your life's changed forever because they are not coming home. And
It is kind of human nature to focus on
right.
that. How did it happen? How did it happen? I mean, I remember I'm a cancer survivor, and I remember family members being like, "But why did you get it?" We don't know. We'll never know.
I'm so sorry. I read about that, and you've been through so much.
But I mean, those are things where you get to talk about that then and tell other people, yeah, you can't, I could have focused on that and I would never have moved off of that, because then your life becomes consumed with how do you prevent it the next time. But I think that's kind of how we get with these disasters too, because we're like, we have to prevent it. We have to make sure that we're safe. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again. And with your situation with Flight 800, like you said, they never really knew what happened.
Right. And it still goes on today. There's a lot of, there's still not actual confirmation of what happened.
And still today, interestingly, you see people talking about it. So I mean, obviously it is one of those things that lasts for a very long time. And that's, from what I've read, it sounds like that is why then you formed the Aircraft Casualty Emotional Support Services. And I want to get that system or that organization name out there, because I think it is so important that people get to hear what it is. But you formed that because there is sometimes a focus on the wrong thing and people need the right people to talk to them, right?
Right, exactly. And really help them feel that they can get through it. Because I think one of the hardest things is just looking ahead and thinking, I can't survive this. I can't get through this. What do I do? How can I can't even see the future. I'm living in the moment right now. And I think sometimes people try to say things like, oh, well, one day you'll get married or one day. And right now, that's not what anyone wants to hear. Right now, living in the moment and focusing on where they are right now. And not trying to make plans to make it go away, the grief go away. It's really focusing on where they are right now. What do they need right now? What did they want to talk about right now?
And you've had a lot of people that have come together. You've had a lot of people that have come together to be a part of this, like your board of directors, your advisory board. It hasn't been something partisan. You've had Mayor Giuliani, you've had Gavin Newsom, you've had all kinds of people that have come together, because when there is tragedy like this, I don't see partisanship should not play a role here. It seems like this is when the country comes together and says, okay, what's the best way to take care of our own?
Right, exactly. And I could, in hindsight, and I look back on so many people who are so amazing that I wish I could still think today. I think that's one of the hardest things that I sometimes have when I still remember right around the same time that they're in right now with the DC incident, just where there are people reaching out and trying to help. And sometimes I can't even remember all their names and stuff. And I would do anything now to be able to go back and thank them for really having just sometimes maybe they didn't say the right thing, but I know their heart was in it and they were so incredible. And I'm just so grateful for the people over that time that really were there for me and helped so much with the memorials. Like you're speaking of the mayor at the time, he came forward, he rolled up his sleeves, he got me in touch with the right people. And so there are some people out there who really made a big difference in actually my grief process. And I'm so grateful to them, and I'm like forever grateful that it really made a big difference in the long run as well. But the main thing with what we do is really making sure people have somebody to talk to who has been in their shoes before, who can provide hope and inspiration and let them know that they can get through it and find the best ways to honor their loved one. And, and that's what a lot of our grief mentors focus on is, here are some things that I did that I thought was helpful. Here are some things that I didn't realize I shouldn't have done. So they kind of learn from each other what they get to share what was helpful and what was hurtful through their process, which I think also helps those who are just starting this journey as well, finding the best ways to remember and honor their loved one.
One of the good things I think about social media at a time like this is that you get to see the people that need help. And that's something that has actually been shocking to me. The number of people that I know on a personal level that have said, oh, my best friend's wife, my sister's best friend, or a family member of mine was on the plane. And it just brings that to light that this is very real. It's very close to you. The country is a lot smaller than you think it is. And you may know someone who has been very closely hit by this tragedy. So for that, I want them to know your organization, but you also wrote a book. Would you suggest that people read that book as well so that they can understand how to talk to people who have gone through this?
Yes, absolutely. The book is a wonderful tool for people who have lost people, but also for people who are providing care, because people really do touch on what was helpful to them, what was hurtful to them, what people said to them that made them feel so much better in the different phases that they were in their grief. And really that is really what the whole book is about, is really like the first moments right when they learned and who they become over time. And I have to say, they're all the most remarkable people who have been through so much, and their stories are incredible and their hearts are huge. These people who come forward to share, because they're doing it to help others. They want to know that if they can share their stories, it can help others. And even the people from this incident one day will be on the other side, where they can come forward to be trained and help, unfortunately, when the next incident occurs. So it's really a community of productively taking your loss and doing something productive with all the hard-earned knowledge that you've acquired from something that's just so hard.
Yeah. And I think people who haven't gone through loss don't understand that grief is not something that it's not one day you're healed. You don't get healed from grief. And grief comes in weird waves at times you're not expecting. A sudden memory, something strikes you, a smell, something hits you, and
Absolutely.
it's very hard. Your book is called Surviving Sudden Loss, Stories from Those Who Have Lived It.
Yes.
I think it's so pertinent right now, not just because of this aircraft, but also we just came through a pandemic. A lot of people had a sudden loss in their life. And even though that was mostly 4 years ago, it is so fresh. 4 years is not a very long time. And I think that you can tell us, but would you recommend the book for those folks as well? Because I think it's very hard. Everybody wanted to get through it. That was also an incredibly political situation. So it's almost like, it's not easy to talk about something when you feel like you're still broken from a situation that people have strong political feelings about.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the book is a really good tool for all of that, and also just being able to see ahead and realize that there's a future for the people they're helping and for them themselves on their journey, to know that they can get through it and that they can survive it. Because I just remember many days where I just couldn't imagine tomorrow and how to get through it. And the pain was so painful and difficult to accept them being gone. And oftentimes everybody's so young and they're just taken from us before their time. And it's just unbelievable and just so difficult to come to terms with, and just to know that you're not in it alone and you're not the only one. Because I kind of remember leaving the air disaster site and not knowing what to do. There was there were no resources at all, but I always wished in my back pocket somebody had given me access to know, even if I don't call right away, I know that that's there for me, and I'm not, there is care out there for me. And I always remember that as kind of when I started this, thinking, if I can know that people can leave a site and leave all the immediate press and all the attention it's getting now, know that now they can call for help, but that they can also call in a few months when they're having a hard time. So we're not focused on just the immediate. We're really there for the long haul. And sometimes people come to us many years later after an incident and just say, I've never really been able to talk about it, and I really need to do that now. And we've had people 5 to 10 years after incidents as well, because we didn't exist back then. So a lot of people came forward from past incidents well before Flight 800 to be a part of Access as well. So it definitely sticks with people, and it's part of their life, and it's part of who they become, and not all in bad ways, but in also the people who I've interviewed are just remarkably strong, incredible people who took what they went through, and then they've turned their lives around in different ways as a result of it, and really put time into honoring and making their loved one who they lost a part of who they are.
Including you. I mean, look at the organization that you've created and how God has used this in your life to be a light to people at their darkest moments. I mean, I look at situations like this and I see people like you who create an organization around this that is so necessary. I mean, we look at these organizations that are for veterans, organizations that are for people that come through cancer. And, you know, this is something you don't think about. Is there an organization for people who go through a sudden aircraft disaster like this? But for someone who's gone through it, now you're and when it happens, it's so many people at once. It's just such a blessing to know that you're out there and that you have this for people. Can you give everybody the address and how to find it? So in case they're in that situation, they will know how to talk to you.
Absolutely. We are here, and our website is accesshelp.org, ACCESSHELP.org. And people can request care there. You're welcome to share your stories if you've been through loss. And if you've been through this and you'd like to also be there for the families and share what you've gone through, we're there for you as well. So we are on call, and we just want to make sure that people know they're not alone in this process and that our community is there. And we've been there for many, many years, and our teams are incredible. We always have 250 grief mentors on call that we train through our organization, and we've had thousands of calls for help over the years from general aviation, military, and commercial crashes. So it's not always these major incidents that you see on the news that we respond to as well. So that's part of our pairing process too. So we pair people from general aviation crashes together because it's a little bit of a different process for them than when they're from a major incident that is highly publicized. So there are differences that we try to, make sure to make it as close to what they went through to have a role model who can provide that kind of perspective to them.
Well, you are such an impressive woman. Heidi, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for sharing this. I know this is a very hard subject, and you have been blessed with the ability to tell your story, and we were blessed with hearing it today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. For this episode and others, go to TudorDixonPodcast.com, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time on the Tudor Dixon Podcast.